How's it going, Dominic?
Jenna, I don't know
You
if you
had to
know
think
about
about it.
this.
You had to
If you
think about
wait,
it.
I don't know if you know about this. We're in the middle of a hostile government takeover, Jenna.
No. And where did you learn such information?
The TikTok.
The clock app. The clock app has
The
been on
clock
fire
app.
lately.
Yes, there's a lot going on right now in the world of journalism and media. There's a whole lot going on.
Of course, and the government. Well, let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Dom. You know what's funny? Not long ago, we were both breaking news. Now we're
Breaking unemployment records.
exactly just like thousands of other journalists who've been laid off from newsrooms across the country.
Yeah, and after the shock wore off, we kept asking ourselves, what the hell do we do now?
And over many, many cups of coffee,
And maybe a few drinks.
we realized we had a unique opportunity here. Why not pull back the curtain on what's really happening in American media?
Right? I mean, we've spent years in this industry seeing how stories get made or don't, and now we can actually talk about it.
And trust me, there's a lot to talk about. From local news disappearing to social media reshaping journalism, we'll break it all down.
And look, we're not here to lecture anybody. We just want to help make sense of the information that we're getting and maybe have some much needed fun along the way.
So whether you're glued to the news, just trying to figure out what's real in your feed, or curious about the future of media, come hang with us.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking, a podcast where two journalists
Are taking a critical look at American media.
Yeah, so in case you haven't noticed, we redid our intro finally.
Hmm.
I
I
know. What?
love it.
No, I love it too. And I think it was more than time. We needed
It
to like
was.
update it to because we've been able to hone in on what we want the show to do and be, et cetera. And so I think that new intro speaks much more clearly about our show.
A little free. It was a little refresh. So, we're more inclusive as to the work that we're doing and not just
Exactly.
being only
We
laid
lost
off.
our jobs. We have to talk about it, which is
Yeah.
kind of where we were before. Yeah, and also I want to say that we have been growing our presence online, specifically social media, I should say. I post pretty regularly, as much as I can, to the TikToks and to Instagram, but most of our traction seems to be on the TikToks. And so, we've been seeing people saving I can see the analytics. So people are saving some of our stuff and they're reposting some of our stuff and stitching some of our stuff. And that's huge for a small indie podcast like,
Huge.
yeah. Um, but not as huge as some other TikTokers, especially, I think, Dom, you have a new favorite pop star.
Really, seriously, I love the song. So, Todd, uh, a gift from Todd, his handle on TikTok,
Hmm.
huge not long ago for he just posted a video talking about the government takeover that we're
Just
experiencing
singing
right
a song
now.
he made up in his kitchen.
And no music behind him, just him, a little ditty and it was loved it.
We're in the middle of a hostile government takeover. I want to talk about it, but I'll be late for work.
And then actually, there was another artist on TikTok who decided to make an EDM version of just that little saying that he did, the hostile government takeover. And the guy who did it was Vinny Marchi, who got his handle on TikTok is very, very Vinny. And that song is on Spotify, has over 100,000 streams. I have it on my my running playlist.
We're in the middle of a hostile government takeover. I want to talk about it, but I'll be late for work.
I
And it's
love it.
going on mine too. I'm going to download it too. And
Love
good
it.
for both of them, especially good for
Yes.
Todd. Good for Todd who
Yes.
took so, because I think a lot of us are trying to figure out ways to process this. And here he was just casually processing as he was getting ready for work one morning, and boom,
And
bruh has
that's the
got a
thing.
top
That's the thing.
something song, I'm guessing.
That's exactly it, Jenna. It's like as content creators, sometimes great ideas either go unnoticed or they just, some other people will take it from you and they make money off of it. I love seeing that he was able to work this out where he's getting something from this. So good for them, and everybody should go listen to Spotify. But
Yes, well, but because we've got big fish to fry today.
Yes, we do.
And so with that, for our show, speaking of a hostile government takeover, um, we have an interview coming up with Jeff Cohen. Jeff is a longtime media critic and founder of FAIR, that's Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. He's also a retired associate professor of journalism at Ithaca College. And he's also a founding director of the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College. Basically, they engage media producers and students in issues of equity, social justice, and sustainability. And there's a lot of ands in this dude's
Mhm.
intro. Jeff is also a co-founder of the online activist group rootsinAction.org, which works to defend the public interest and expand social justice. So, welcome to the show, Jeff.
Nice to be with you.
All right. So, FAIR, just and so that it's crystal clear, it stands for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. First of all, tell us about what the mission of this organization is and why you felt it was necessary in 1986, almost, wow, 40 years ago.
Wow.
It was an interesting era. It had some parallels to today. Um, the president of the United States, when I formed FAIR, was Reagan. Uh, right before I came to New York to start FAIR, Time magazine had a cover story about Reagan with fireworks above him. Um, it was as if you were reading North Korean magazine about its leadership in North Korea. It was a time, there was a book about this called On Bended Knee, about how reporters were in Washington. That's the Mark Hertsgaard book, um, being very solicitous and not being truthful and blunt in coverage of Reagan. And the other thing that's a parallel is that the conglomerates were just booming. They were growing. We only had, there were basically three main TV networks that had news shows.
Mm,
And NBC was taken over by General Electric. CBS was taken over by Westinghouse. At the time I founded FAIR, ABC merged with Capital Cities. And these mergers in prior times would have been challenged or questioned. But by the 1980s, during the Reagan, neoliberalism, they just went through. And so you had two of the three main news channels or two of the three main broadcast channels were owned by companies that were the major companies behind the nuclear power industry, which I always thought was interesting. And all of those companies got swallowed up later by even bigger companies. ABC, Capital Cities taken over by Disney, CBS Westinghouse taken over by Sumner Redstone, a media mogul connected to Viacom, and General Electric ultimately recently taken over by Comcast, or at least the media properties were taken over by the giant telecommunications conglomerate known as Comcast.
yeah. Yeah.
All of these companies, as we pointed out back in 1986, more important today,
Hmm.
all of these companies have major lobbying arms in Washington. They are not neutral. They are not about good government and democracy. They're about increasing their bottom line. And we could see that in the 1980s. When we started FAIR, it was a few years after Ben Bagdikian, the heroic journalist who played a role with the Pentagon Papers in the Washington Post when he was a top editor. And he wrote the book, The Media Monopoly, in, I think it was 82, 83. And then we asked him to write the cover story for the first issue of our publication for FAIR in 1987. And his book had said 50 corporations here are the 50 corporations that control what Americans see, hear, and read through the media. But by
Wow.
the time we started FAIR, we put a slash through the number 50 because the Bagdickian number had already shrunk to 26.
Mm.
And when we started FAIR, we talked about these companies, they're the ultimate gatekeepers. And now jump forward to today, where you have uh, gatekeepers like Jeff Bezos, who owns the
Mhm.
Washington Post, Zuckerberg, Facebook, Instagram, Google changing the name of Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America because the president said so. So we're at this point where what Fair warned about in 1986, that you can't trust journalism when the gatekeepers are these corporate, increasingly big, politically active corporations that have a lot of interests of their own, and especially the interest not offending the federal government when they want the FCC to keep changing the rules to allow these fat companies to get even bigger. So, I mean, what we warned about in 1986 almost seems like tiddlywinks because
But
right
still, I mean,
now,
the warnings were there. I feel like as people are starting to look back on even recent history to realize that no, there were warning signs the whole time. There were people who were saying, guys, we should pay attention to this. But excuse me, maybe the good times are rolling too good for enough people
yeah, and it
to
was never
dismiss.
good. It was never good for the journalists. Like one of my favorite, I've written hundreds of columns of media criticism, and often in mainstream dailies. And I had one in the LA Times in 19, I think it was 91. So it's like 5 years after FAIR started. And an enterprising reporter from People magazine had gotten into this exclusive male only uh, gathering at the Bohemian Grove, where the
Hmm.
most powerful people in the world get, I should say men, the most powerful men gather, and they have their druid fire rituals, and they get naked, it's weird. And the People magazine, I think he was the head of the bureau in San Francisco. He thought it was a great story for people, and he got in. He snuck in, and he was coming up with amazing stuff. And the editor was so impressed that they gave him more column inches. The problem is that the third time he went into the Bohemian Grove, this is the reporter from People magazine, an executive from Time Warner noticed him and had him thrown out. And even though he'd been thrown out, he thought, gee, I've got a big story, and my editor agrees. He's giving me more inches in the magazine to write this fascinating little story about Bohemian Grove and how the rich and powerful men gather. And then the article got spiked, of course.
Hmm.
And then a few months later, this guy's name was Dirk Matheson. I don't know if he's alive. Uh, he lost his job. And to me, the end of my column was that Time had just merged with Warner in 1990. Time was a news company, Warner an entertainment and Hollywood company, and it created the biggest media conglomerate known to person at that time. And when that happened, because companies often go into debt with these mergers, and then the first thing they have to do is lay off employees. A lot of the journalists working for Times magazines, all of the various magazines, including People magazine, they were worried. And Steve Ross, the CEO of the new Time Warner, makes a comment. He goes on and on about if you're a journalist, you want to be at a strong international company where we can nurture you. You want to be a part of one of these strong, big companies. And Steve Ross, the CEO of the merged Time and Warner, he earned $78 million in compensation that year. but they went forward and laid off, as they usually do, 600 magazine employees from Time, including Dirk Matheson at People, who had written this expose, this really great, interesting story that never got published. And we did the calculations at FAIR, and FAIR was attuned to these mergers and how it would negatively impact journalists back at the beginning. But we did some calculations that Steve Ross, he could have earned about 30 or $40 million that year and not fired one journalist.
Mm.
But that's what we've got now. You know, the crisis of journalism is the crisis of society. It's that all the wealth has been gushing up from the working class and middle class to the top 1%, and it's happened just graphically in the media industry. You've got these billionaires kissing the feet of the president. Well, that's not what journalists do. But if you're a journalist who works for one of those billionaires, you're going to know what the billionaires are doing. So it's dire. It's you know, we were worried about this, the corporate media, the corporatized, conglomerated media in 1986. It's only gotten worse.
Can I ask you, Jeff, like, you know, we're seeing a president right now, Trump in office, how he's dealing with the media and what he's trying to do with the media. Looking back at how Reagan back then was dealing with the media, how, since you were, you know, you started FAIR at that time, do you see comparisons between the two presidents and how they, or do you see, like, how do you see the, you know, the relationship between how they both dealt with the media?
Yeah, it's so much more blatant now. In the 80s, sure, these companies were worried about offending Reagan because of the FCC, especially they have broadcast licenses. But Reagan wasn't threatening journalists. Reagan's FCC wasn't threatening to challenge broadcast licenses. Again, I remember that period very, very well. You had a horrible FCC chair named Fowler who said, oh, you know, in terms of why we should deregulate television, it's just a toaster with pictures. And so, you know, you've got, but now, so that was like a laissez-faire head of the FCC. Now you have this guy, you know, Trump's chair, who's an absolute ideologue, Brendan Carr. And he's talking about investigating companies that are, you know, investigating television channels that are doing journalism that he doesn't like. And so it's just more naked, it's more blatant. You know, I mean, Reagan didn't threaten to sue everyone or sue everyone.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Disney capitulation could be brought up now because I remember when Disney took over ABC and it was very worrying for journalism. Remember, as these once news, William Paley was a broadcaster who believed in journalism when he owned CBS. You know, he was the pioneer behind CBS. The early broadcasters, for all of their faults, they believed in journalism. Disney doesn't care about journalism. Journalism in these media conglomerates, these entertainment conglomerates, is just a tiny part of what they do. And what they do is make astronomical profits, and they will do anything to keep the government happy. And the Disney just gave, in essence, a payout. It was about $15 million.
We covered that, or we talked about it, I should say.
I'm sure you did. Yeah. I mean, you guys know all of this, but it's more naked. I've got the overview because I've been doing this for 40 years. And you could see the crisis beginning in the 80s. Ben Bagdikian, lifelong newspaper person, he understood what was happening when he wrote The Media Monopoly. And every time he would put out a new edition, they'd have to change the number, you know, the Bagdikian number of how many companies you need where they control a majority of the news content. And it shrunk from 50 to 26 to a dozen. At FAIR, we called that the Bagdikian number. It's sort of like the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they have their clock approaching midnight because of the threat of nuclear disaster. Well, we saw the number of corporations that were dominating, controlling a majority of news content just shrink and shrink, and the journalists became a tinier part of these giant conglomerates. And now we're at a point, I mean, do we really think that Google, Facebook, Bezos, they care about journalism? They don't give a damn. And that's the problem with the conglomerated system of news.
Well, as we've discussed several times on this podcast, I mean, everything that you're discussing and that you're pointing out is seems to be kind of why we've lost the public trust overall. Because poll after poll shows that the public does not believe journalists, which is challenging as a journalist because I know that none of us went into this calling, if you will, with any intention of misleading. It was to speak truth to power. It was to, have transparency and, hold the powerful accountable, which I get is the same thing. But the point is, it's one thing to study it a certain way, and it's another thing to practice it in real world under certain organizations.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, most journalists consider it a calling.
Yeah.
And the better journalists are the ones who really see it as a calling and are willing to risk their jobs. And the ones that are willing to risk their jobs are the first to lose them. Um, I can remember, I mean, my friends, these two academics, Robert McChesney and Victor Pickard, they wrote a book about the collapse of journalism, and the title was, Will the Last Reporter Turn Out the Lights?
I believe we speak with Victor
We had Vic
early
Picard, yeah.
on. We
Yeah,
had him
We had
on.
Victor on.
Victor's a real star. He's a real scholar of this stuff. But what Victor has pointed out, and McChesney years before, is that newspapers, before the internet hit, newspapers were just one of the most profitable companies you could own. They were often considered, newspapers a license to print money. And in many cities, beginning in the 80s, Gannett was arranging for there to be just one newspaper in monopoly, and they would buy it. Or they would buy the biggest paper, crush the competition by lowering the rates of advertising, and then when they got rid of the competition, raise it again. So we had a system, and again, this is because of what began under Reagan, which is deregulation, neoliberalism. You never question a merger. The antitrust division of the Justice Department basically for 40 years has been inoperative. And so you had Gannett basically chaining up the newspapers in the country. And they were so profitable, they were getting more than 20% return on investment, which is incredible for a company. And what they were doing is when they would pick up another newspaper or 5 or 10, they would go into debt in order to finance the purchase.
Mm-hmm.
And what would happen? They would lay off their journalists. So the great columnist Molly Ivins was writing back then in the 90s, we have weakened our product. We are getting thinner and thinner. The best reporters are leaving the business or getting fired. And this was before the internet. That's what people don't, people think the internet wiped out newspapers. In other countries, newspapers are not being wiped out. In other countries, in other words, corporate greed and corporate monopolization and chaining had already weakened newspapers, so they were easy prey.
Mm-hmm.
When
Wow.
the internet came along, the newspapers already were weaker and weaker, were not trusted, were not covering City Hall like they used to cover City Hall. So it's like this process, and I hate to hear, oh, the internet killed all the newspapers. The newspaper owners killed the newspapers. And that's what these academics like McChesney and Picard have proven.
All right.
You
Well,
know,
speaking, oh, Dom, what were you going to say?
oh no, I was going to say we were just going to go into the few of the headlines right now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, speaking of people who
Yeah,
kill,
yeah,
yes, the newspaper owners who killed the newspapers, even though we're not just talking about newspapers, but we can start with a once newspaper man. Dom, you want to take it away?
yeah, yeah. So, Jeff, we recently, Paul Krugman, who used to be a columnist for the New York Times, he was in an interview on MSNBC with Ari Melber. And Ari had asked Paul a question about his recent departure from the Times and basically about how major news organizations, including his former employer, how they're handling the coverage of the Trump administration, particularly when it comes to holding them accountable, accountable. So we're going to toss to a clip of what Paul Krugman had to say to that question.
I mean, the conventional news media are invaluable. So, I depend upon the reporting from my old employer. I depend upon the reporting from other news organizations. But there's definitely sane washing that goes on. Definitely an unwillingness to just flatly report and we have crazy stuff that was true during the campaigns, even more so now. And it really, if all you do is read the papers, that you don't get all of that. So this is why, I'm happy to be now free to, have a fairly substantial subscription base already and be able to talk about this stuff without trying to sound moderate and sensible, because these are not moderate and sensible times.
So, Jeff, hearing what Paul had to say about the reluctance in mainstream media to just call things as they are, basically what he's calling sane washing, the president and the administration. Does that line up to what you're seeing in today's news?
Yeah, and I'm no longer with FAIR. I'm the founder of FAIR,
Right.
fair.org. But it seems like every week they're putting out a new critique of how something outlandish happened. And the headline in the lead was just, as you say, as Krugman's, sane washing. They're trying to make the abnormal look normal. Journalism is supposed to, if something's abnormal, say it's abnormal.
Mm-hmm.
And so fair.org has been really going to town on this, just the choice of words in the headlines, the choice of characterizations of what Trump or Musk are doing. You gotta, if something's abnormal, you let your readers or listeners or viewers know it's abnormal.
Well, I'm wondering though, because we also live in a political climate, and this is also part of another headline we'll discuss, but we live in a climate right now where if a newspaper were to do that, they would automatically get labeled as being against a particular side. Like if someone were to say what the Trump administration is doing is abnormal in any place other than the opinion column, well, that paper would be, you're left wing, you're woke, you're radical, you're progressive, you're anti Republican or anti-American, I'm sure is what they'd say now. But how, what do you do when the situation has gotten so far that any criticism is labeled as anti fill in the blank
Yeah,
instead
I
of just
think you have to,
criticism?
yeah, I hear you. I think you've got to tune out that criticism. Trump has done something that autocrats have done throughout the ages, especially in the last 100 years, which is delegitimize any criticism. So that if there's anything critical of our great leader, it's obviously false propaganda. He's done a brilliant job of that. But see, I don't think it's that hard to say this is abnormal. If you say no administration, Democrat or Republican, has ever done this. The last time anything happened like this, it was 1933 during the height of the Depression. You don't just, you're not doing an editorial if you're writing news. You're reporting the news, but you can still report it in an accurate way by proving with facts this is abnormal. So that's what I'm asking. I'm not asking for every reporter to become an editorialist. But the problem is often with the editors. I think the reporters are out there and saying this is, to themselves at least, this is abnormal. And when they try to reflect that, I'm assuming there's some editing going on Um, but yeah, I think sane washing is going on, normalization is going on. That's something reporters should never do. And let's face it, the globe, we're in a crisis here. And it's been a crisis for journalism for decades because of corporate greed. But now the crisis is amplified by Trump, the attacks on journalists, the attacks especially on Black women journalists, the threats to sue, the actual suits, the threats to have the FCC investigate, and there will actually be FCC investigations. That's abnormal. The FCC does not investigate whether someone's fair or biased. That's not what they've done.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the FCC, well, I don't want to get started there. But yeah, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission, which should have, over the decades, obstructed some of these mergers. And now we're stuck with the media and information concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer billionaires than ever before.
But Jeff, when you think about things like the suit with ABC News, right? CBS News, what's going on, what's happening right now with CBS News in 60 Minutes. The fear from a lot of these companies is the weaponization of the office, and what does that mean for them? So the fear why that more moderate tone becomes kind of like, well, we're going to tone it down because we don't know what's going to come at us. To me, that's really kind of scary, where people don't know, the fear might be like, we have to tap dance around this as much as possible, because if we say the wrong thing, we're getting a lawsuit. So how do you get good journalism?
Speak truth to power. Yeah.
That's why these corporations should not control the news business.
Well, I'm going to ask you this though, but they do now. So how do we hold them accountable when they do? Like, it's great. Yeah. How do we change that? Like, I guess that's my frustration, because it's like, I get it. Well, listen, we've talked about hedge funds owning companies, these media outlets. We've talked about billionaires. The reality is they do own it right now. So how do we deal with this type of situation if we're not, like when or the damage has been done in a way?
Yeah. I never thought I would see, like, you're saying these companies are worried about what's going to come at them, and you're right. But what they've engaged in is what in countries that have moved toward dictatorship or fascism, it's what the academics and the historians call anticipatory obedience. And when I never thought I would witness heads of corporations donating $1 million each and getting the first row in an inauguration, again, abnormal. That's where governors sit of both parties. These guys who are the gatekeepers of our information society, Google, Microsoft, Meta, Bezos, no inauguration ever received so much money from corporations. And the media moguls, the tech moguls, were front and center. So you're right. If I worked for one of those guys, I'd be scared out of my wits. I mean, the way around it is, and this is what I taught at Ithaca College for 10 years, you almost have to go on your own. You have to work at an independent. You have to work at a nonprofit. Some of them are decently funded. They're all struggling. I know that. But gee, I'd rather go to work at ProPublica than to have to work for one of these guys. I think there is no way of saving journalism when it's in the hands of the conglomerates. People have got to create their own, whether it's Substack or podcasts like you're doing, or affiliate with a nonprofit, which sometimes mean your salary is now, 60% of what it used to be. But those are the only solutions if you want to do journalism, because trust me, I've watched this since 1986. It only gets worse every year. and the owners of the media, they don't care about journalism. Paley did when he ran CBS. But these people don't give a damn. I mean, look at the Washington Post censoring the cartoonist. I'm sure you discussed that
We
already.
definitely did.
Yeah. I mean, it's just that, and, you know, and so when you hear editors, you know, I worked at mainstream TV news. I was at MSNBC, CNN. I was even on Fox News every week for 5 years. So I've seen the people at the top of corporate hierarchies. What your audience, your viewers and listeners need to understand is media operations, media organizations are strict corporate hierarchies. The workers are not in control any more than the workers who work for General Motors control their factories. The workers are not in control. The people at the top make the big decisions. And when you see people who are running news organizations just blatantly lying, I saw this when I was at MSNBC and I worked with Phil Donahue, and we all got fired for political reasons, and they lied and said it was over ratings. And then the internal memos came out and proved they were lying. But when I saw these executives there and elsewhere that were lying, and now you come up to today, you covered the cartoon that was suppressed. Bezos is depicted in the cartoon on bended knee, holding money bags, giving it to the Trump, who's on the pedestal. And the editor says, well, we'd already covered this issue in a cartoon and a couple columns. That's an obvious lie. I mean, everyone knows it, you know.
Actually, I think what speaks most to, and this is just the, audio journalist in me,
Yeah,
the pause, that sort of like that moment of just like, did we all see what's going on here?
yeah.
That to me is that's the crux of the whole thing. I did
mean,
want to
keep in mind that the Washington Post sometimes will cover an issue with 50 editorials, 80 op-ed pieces,
Yes.
13 cartoons. And when the editor says that, and everyone in the newsroom knows he's lying, it sends a message to the journalists, maybe we should start lying if we want to keep our job. I mean, again, I think that the people that rise to the top in news outlets, in my view, generally cannot report their way out of a paper bag. They're in those executive positions because they're good diplomats, they're good dealing with corporate power, but they're not journalists. And when they are capable of just increasingly lying. I mean, we saw it at the LA Times when they were not allowed to endorse Kamala Harris against Trump. You know, these owners are getting more and more aggressive than they ever were. And it's almost lights out for journalists who work for these conglomerates.
That last point hit really hard. I just wanted to I just wanted to make the point that when you were talking about, corporate versus smaller independent newspapers, I wonder if they also, because we are seeing that the Trump administration is, advising the Department of Justice. We're talking about the US government has unlimited funds to go after journalists who they deem are printing lies, let's say. So could what is going on in a lot of corporate structure media, legacy institutions that are owned by these billionaires, et cetera, could that not trickle down? A small independent, online paper or something, God knows me and Dom do not have the resources to fight a law firm, let alone the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, you know about the law that's been passed that where the IRS can strip with almost no due process, strip a nonprofit of their 501c3 status
Oh,
if
yeah.
they support terrorism. So the group I've been worried about in the media is The Intercept, which is one of my favorite publications, but they really cover Israel-Palestine closely. And I just wonder, The Intercept or Drop Site News, where Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm, I expect the IRS is going to start coming after some of these nonprofit groups and some of these nonprofit news outlets.
He's already called out
And
ProPublica.
yeah, it's dire. And the one thing I'm a recovering attorney, so you know, in a prior life, I was actually briefly an attorney. The one thing I know is progressive attorneys, and when these nonprofits start losing their C3 status, they're all going to get pro bono legal representation. If Trump comes after a nonprofit news outlet, I would expect them to get very good, very solid, free legal counsel. And when the government does come after you, you go to your subscribers, your members. We need money. You've seen the headlines. They're coming after us, and you can pay the legal fees for the lawyers who will often donate their time. But yeah, I think that you've just laid out where we're heading. It's going to be they're going to pick off the smaller independent news outlets first, even though they're going to blow smoke at the biggest ones as well. But they'll try to terminate the smaller indies, the nonprofits, and that's where the fight will ensue.
So, Jeff, we want to shift to a different topic, which is the whole White House AP drama that's been going on. So last week, Jen and I, we talked about, how the White House had barred the AP reporters over certain events because the AP was refusing to use the Gulf of America over the Gulf of Mexico, right? So this week, Trump told Axios that the AP won't regain access until they agree that it's the Gulf of Mexico. The AP, of course, is like, we're not backing down from this. The Axios also reported that Trump aides see AP's influential style book, which is, for people who don't know, that's a newsroom. It's a
The
style
AP
book
style book is Bible in newsrooms.
yes, for newsrooms across we're actually worldwide, over writing and editing guidelines, how we phrase certain things. So basically, Trump aides say that they're saying that the Trump aides see this as that style book has a liberal bias, which is another reason for this crackdown. Of course, the AP is like, they reject that characterization of it all. So Jeff, the question is, Trump is taking on, like, the Trump administration is taking on one of the biggest, most influential news organizations out there. What happens? What are the consequences if he wins this fight? If he's able to break something like the AP? Because you do wonder how long this can go on. I mean, that's the first question, is like, what happens if Ariel's will break them to make changes like something like this? And again, this is only like a few days and a few weeks into this whole administration.
It's stunning. It's abnormal, as we were saying before. Who's the main culprit? It's Google. I mean, Google went along with this. I was checking Google Maps every day, and I saw it, I think, within a half hour of them changing it on Google Maps. So that's the problem, is it begins with the conglomerates. And then let's go down to the rank and file. The White House Correspondents Association, or whatever it's called. I see their dinners. Can't they show a little solidarity that well, AP's not coming, we're not coming? I mean, again, these are abnormal times, and journalists have to band together. And I don't know what they could, I'm not giving advice, but there needed to be solidarity from day one. When AP's excluded from the room, what do you do?
Well, that's if they still have the correspondence dinner. Like, I mean, in the last Trump administration, they stopped doing it because he was like, I don't like you making fun of me.
But you mentioned this, Jeff, about gathering together. It's interesting because, like, Jim Acosta, who used to work, the former CNN White House correspondent, he was doing an interview where he offered some advice, and his whole thing was, he was saying how there should be a media boycott. I'm looking over here. He said something about, he argued that Trump thrives on media attention, so maybe if the press would boycott, it would be a strategic move because you wouldn't get the information out there. And he also mentioned something about that maybe there's a way for AP to file some kind of legal precedent against the White House for its ban. Um, I guess, like, how does that, what do you think of, like, when you talk about a ban? I mean, to me, my only concern is if you have a press banning of the at the White House, like, you're still going to have conservative media. You're still going to have a lot of those other outlets. Truth Social will be out there reporting stuff, like, his own thing. He'll still get information out there that he wants to get out there. Does that really
Yeah,
solve anything?
yeah. I'm not sure about a boycott, but certainly something should have happened from the White House correspondents that were not in AP. And I don't know what, if something happened, I missed it. And, uh, I studied journalism around the globe. I can remember when all of the journalists, the biggest journalists from the biggest outlets in Spain, I think one of their people had been killed. Maybe it was during the Iraq War. And as the news conference begins, all of them turn around and put their backs to the guy in power whose news conference they were all attending. The cameramen all shut off their. I mean, we don't have that in this country.
Oh my God, editors would I could hear the screaming from the
Yeah,
newsroom now.
yeah,
If
no doubt.
someone dared to do that.
Yeah, but again, uh, besides having corporations have more power over our media than in other advanced industrial democratic countries, we also have some of the weakest journalism unions. And in other places, the journalists union would organize these things where we all got to stand together. We compete for audience, we compete for readership, but on something like this, we all have to stand together.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I'm glad to see all the unionization that has gone on in the last few years at online news outlets, Huffington Post, a bunch of them, HuffPost.
Hmm.
But we, in general, have weak unions in society and even weaker journalism unions, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. I guess when it comes to the White House press corps, which listen, I haven't worked there, so I can't speak to, but I will say watching the press conferences, I don't see solidarity even in the questions. Like I've seen so many press conferences where someone asks a really good question and whoever is at the podium doesn't answer and the next person just moves on to something else as if that really good question. Like can we show some solidarity and just get a straight answer?
Hmm.
Your criticism, we've been making it at FAIR. Other journalism professors have been making that criticism for so many years. They don't hang together. There isn't solidarity. You didn't answer my colleague's question, so I'll rephrase it, and
Yeah.
I'm looking for an answer. The other thing they could be doing with the AP situation is just to agree to preface every question they ask with, I want to formally, on behalf of my news organization,
Mm.
protest the exclusion of AP now, and then ask the question. Every single person should do that. Obviously, the right wingers won't, but everyone from a legitimate mainstream news outlet should do that. And I haven't seen that. If it happened, I missed it, and I hope I missed it. But yeah, we're in a dire situation here. And it's ironic. I've studied the history of U.S. media criticism, and probably the first book of media criticism was called The Brass Check, and it was written by Upton Sinclair
Oh,
in the
I know his
20s.
name. Yeah.
And
We
it
all
was,
love The Jungle in seventh grade.
yeah, yeah.
Why we didn't read this other book, I don't know.
Right. And The Jungle was an amazing book. Like many journalists of that era, they really cared about poor people and working class people. And Upton Sinclair wrote that his series, it was in a socialist newspaper called Appeal to Reason. Then it became the book, The Jungle. And it forced some federal action. He was aiming to, this is how workers are exploited. And instead, it turned into the Food and Drug Administration, that protect safe, make the food safer. It was a book about the meatpacking workers. But after that book, he wrote The Brass Check, and it was about how journalists have to shade things against unions on behalf of companies. And the main culprit in the book, chapter after chapter, is the Associated Press. They were so powerful back then. He saw them as just reactionary, usually giving the corporate point of view and not the worker or labor or union point of view. And it's a fascinating book to look back at when we see now that AP is being snubbed.
Mm-hmm.
They're the bulwark. They're almost the core of mainstream journalism, and they're being snubbed, and they're not getting the solidarity that you guys and I believe they need.
Well, is it
Well, it's like if
possible?
you, okay,
Oh,
Jeff.
no, I was just going to say on that thread thought pattern, I guess. Is it possible though? Because what I could also see is the one-upmanship is definitely there. So you keep asking me about the AP, and they've already been banned from this press briefing room. So now I'm going to ban you. And now I'm going to ban you. And now I'm going to ban you. And now it's nothing but OAN types organizations in the press briefing room, and everybody else is standing out in the hallway.
I frankly think that's where we're coming.
Ugh.
I
I can't imagine a way around it. I don't think AP is going to be the only group they go after. And I think um, he's going to try to do news conferences without journalists. And his press secretary will be doing them without real journalists. They'll just be propagandists. That's how you know we're really another giant step toward fascism. But I can't imagine a way around it. Can you? I mean, don't we think the minimum that they could do is, before I ask my question, I just want to protest the exclusion of Associated Press. And now my question is, and if she bans, I can't imagine they're going to start succumbing to, and yes, we may end up with press conferences where no real journalists are present.
Which is a scary thought, because
Yes.
how does that information then make it out to the public? How,
Right.
if there is no, check of power, what happens then?
Yeah, well, the check on power is how you report the news, and you don't have to be in the news in
Sure.
the White House press room to do that kind of check on power. I mean, the great journalist I.F. Stone, who was a hero of journalism in the 50s, 60s, 70s, he was hard of hearing and almost blind, and he wasn't allowed into the White House press briefings and the Defense Department. But what he would do is just go through the documents. And every week in the I.F. Stone's Weekly, he would expose something. And some of them became scandals, and the rest of the mainstream media picked them up. But he did it, and he never attended he didn't interview a president. He wasn't in the White House press briefing room. You don't have to be to do good journalism. But I'm not saying they should all leave, but they should all show some solidarity. And if it means they all end up getting banned, so be it. But you can't allow this to happen. You can't allow Associated Press to be out there alone. Google's the ones who started the mess, understandably. That they are not journalists. They have a slogan, "Don't be evil," which is a very, very low bar, and they can't surmount it.
Ooh.
Changing, because the president wants words changed, and then you change your maps. I mean, that's evil. And they're not even standing up for their ridiculously low bar slogan, "Don't be evil." And it's, again, at FAIR, we've been tracking corporate censorship, corporate firings of people for political reasons, corporate memos that really muffle journalism. But it's worse than it's ever been. And I know, you've got a lot of probably laid off journalists
Mhm.
watching and listening, I'm sure this hasn't been cheerful. But that's the situation we're in.
Well, I see
Um,
people, it's strange because what we're seeing a pattern of, and I think Dom, our next headline will get to that, is that we're seeing people leave willingly because, I don't know, a buyout or you were encouraged, whatever that may be, and or laid off, and then going, independent, and then once being, as Paul Krugman said, I'm free now, pretty much saying everything you're saying. This is what's going on behind the scenes at this, legacy media institution. And this is why some of you are feeling like, wait a second, I'm seeing this, this, and this, but it's not coinciding with what I'm reading in the paper, what I'm seeing on TV or hearing on the radio, etc. So, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, but that's the danger. But that's the part that's frustrating is the fact that the only time you get that truth, though, is when the people leave the organization that they work for. Once they separate, and actually, that does kind of lead into what we were talking. Our last headline over here, Jeff, which was about I wanted there was a good piece in Status, which is a nightly media newsletter, and it's from Oliver Darcy. He's a former CNN media reporter. Now he left CNN on his own because a lot of people they sort of realize, hey, I could have more freedom and get my information out there and make a living doing this on my own. So he recently wrote a piece called Trumpocalypse Now. And really, it's chilling because it kind of reads like a real red alert for American democracy. And what he wrote here is here's part of what I'm reading directly from his piece. He wrote, after years of warnings about what Donald Trump would do if he returned to power, the president is dismantling institutions. And yet, you wouldn't quite realize it from the tone of the news coverage. To be clear, reporters on the battlefield are doing what they can as they are besieged with the chaos that is defining Trump's second term, all while grappling with layoffs and cuts rippling through the media industry. Most news bosses aren't demanding screaming headlines in monster-sized font. They aren't expanding the evening news beyond the allotted 30 minutes, and they are allowing television shows to remain married to irresponsible both sides oriented panels as if one of those sides isn't upending the rule of law, shattering longstanding norms, and threatening the country's bedrock principles. So, I mean, it's fascinating. So, it basically, Jeff, like, how, what do
yeah.
you think about what he's written? I mean, I guess that's my thing. What do you think about what I've just said
Well,
there?
I don't know how we could say it better. That what you would have expected to happen, they do it with war because they believe war is great for ratings. They expand their 30 minutes to an hour.
Mm.
They're all afraid, the conglomerates that own these new the news channels and the broadcast networks don't want to do that because they might get AP.
Mm-hmm.
They may be investigated by Brendan Carr, who's a right-wing nut, ideologue at the FCC. So, but that's obvious what should happen. I mean, Oliver Darcy said it perfectly. The way you convey to your readers, listeners, or viewers that this is abnormal is by taking abnormal steps. We did that after 9/11, the tragedy of 9/11, and news was expanded and it was personal and it was dramatic. Um, we're going through something now, everyone knows it, uh, and every journalist knows it, and it requires an extension of the news. I want to see more demands from the base. And I know, I speak as someone who was terminated 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq because of the invasion of Iraq, along with Phil Donahue at MSNBC. But I would love to see more of the base making demands, uh, of Lester and his boss at NBC Nightly. This week has been so newsworthy. Why don't we expand it? They sometimes will say special coverage, but I haven't seen anything go beyond 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And I watch the nightly news shows on all three broadcast channels every night. It's a habit I've been trying to break, but I can't. And what I do besides watching the news is I count the 21 minutes of news and the 9 minutes of commercials. and I encourage all TV news viewers or, count the commercials. The biggest sponsor of the news is the pharmaceutical industry. Another major sponsor is oil and gas. Another is health insurers. You know, that's also putting pressure on journalism to be truthful. So you raised it earlier about going independent. The problem is, how do you monetize it? Or you affiliate with your colleagues who also got laid off or took buyouts. But people are sorting it out and figuring it out. The media system at the top is monopolized and conglomerated. But at the base, because of the internet, and unfortunately we could name who the people that run the internet, Google, they're not exactly brave people. But while we have an internet, it allows small independents and individuals to reach an audience. Now, we've lost net neutrality, or we're losing it.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting to me is, and this is something that like MSNBC, which is always accused of being the left-wing balance to right-wing Fox News. On MSNBC, when the lobbyists for their boss, when Comcast lobbyists were working hand in hand with Fox lobbyists to make sure that the consumer advocate that Joe Biden had nominated to be on the Federal Communications Commission, her nomination was gummed up for a year and a half, and everyone knew who was lobbying. You couldn't get that mentioned on MSNBC because of their owner, Comcast. And, Comcast and Verizon, they've been winning these victories because of Trump on net neutrality. And if they are allowed to obliterate the practice that we've had for decades of net neutrality, where the gatekeeper who brings you your internet service provider, whether it's Verizon or Comcast or Spectrum, there's only a few of them that are huge. If they're allowed to take websites they do not like, or websites that do not pay them, or websites they do not own, and put them in the slow lane, that's why, to me, net neutrality was the main free speech and free press issue of the last decade. And it was funny that on the left wing MSNBC, they didn't cover that any more than Fox News did, because their lobbyist for their owner was trying to gut net neutrality. And again, we're going to see weird stuff happening in that realm as well. But there are no easy answers to the problem of journalism that's been taken over by big corporations beginning in the 80s and gotten worse and worse today, up through today. There's no simple answer. In other countries, where they can, like Norway, the government gives money. First of all, public broadcasting throughout Europe is powerful. I saw something even a month ago about how popular public broadcasting channels were in Europe. They're still the most powerful channels. They're the most watched. They're the most respected. And besides having well-funded independent public broadcasting in much of Europe and elsewhere, in a place like Norway, the government funds newspapers and websites, subsidizes them, left, right, or center. It's got nothing to do with their, when a new government takes power, they're not allowed to punish the news outlet on the other side. That's the only answer. There's billions of dollars in the federal government. Bob McChesney and Victor Pickard have talked about these issues going back to the 90s, when there was actually a government surplus under Clinton. And there was talk of ways of subsidizing journalism when it was beginning to collapse. We could see it collapsing.
Government surplus. That's such a foreign phrase to me.
Mhm.
Yeah, but there was a government surplus. I remember when Obama was campaigning in 2008, and he was trying to get all the progressive public interest groups to endorse him. And he came to the group that was then pretty powerful called Free Press, which Bob McChesney was a co-founder of with John Nichols of The Nation. And we were having huge conferences, thousands of journalists and media consumers and activists. And they went to Obama and they said, here's our agenda, and Obama pretended to be for that agenda. And then he gets into power. And, the idea of reforming the media to try to protect journalists just didn't ever come up. And indeed, he appointed one of the worst FCC chairs, not as bad as the current one, or the
Brendan
one
Carr.
you mentioned, who was in the Reagan administration, Fowler, who referred to television as just a toaster with pictures. But he appointed this guy, Tom Wheeler, who why did he get that appointment? He had been the chief lobbyist for the cable television industry. And then later he became the chief lobbyist for the cell phone industry, both industries regulated by the FCC. He's exactly the kind of guy that Obama had promised would not be appointed. So this problem of corporate capture of journalism is also corporate capture of government. The two things are going hand in hand.
Well, on that note,
Yeah.
Tom, do you want to do our wrap up?
Oh, so yeah, Jeff, we always ask our guest, the last question is what led them to become to journalism? What was their journalism, story?
Yeah, I could give mine. Mine is a short one.
Oh,
As a teenager, I was into the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And with civil rights, the media played an important role, mainstream, 63, 64, 65. But when Martin Luther King Jr. started talking about economics and the problems with corporate capitalism in 1967, 68, he became anathema. Mainstream editorialists were attacking him in the New York Times, Life magazine, Washington Post. So I came to journalism because I saw how important it had been and how biased it could be with regard to the Vietnam War. And then I watched the heroes of the Pentagon Papers, beginning with Dan Ellsberg, the whistleblower, and the journalist he worked with, including Ben Bagdikian. So, I mean, you can't have I agree with the Thomas Jefferson quote, a government, I'd rather have newspapers without government rather than a government without newspapers. And so
TJ said that.
I always understood the importance of journalism. I was a journalist from a very young age, but I mostly wrote for underground papers or African American oriented newspaper in Detroit. So, I mean, journalism is this calling. I think Jenna said it. It's a calling.
Mhm.
It's like going into nursing or a school teacher, a doctor. It's not just a profession. It's a calling. It's a way of life. And I feel sick for all of the laid off journalists, but there have to be ways of, either use your journalism skills for nonprofit groups that can hire you in their communications department. Too many journalists are getting laid off, fired, terminated, and then they work for PR. And as you know, there are far more public relations staff than there are journalists, and that gap keeps growing. Victor Pickard is one of the people that always quantifies how we have far more people doing public relations for big business or government than are actually reporting news. But I believe that it's a calling. You got to figure out a way to use your skills of being able to analyze information, report information in a clear and honest and factual way, and serve the public good. Democracy is empty without journalism. We're learning that in spades, even in the last few weeks. And we've been learning it in the last few years as journalism has whittled down. When I saw the entertainment conglomerates taking over news, and then I saw that incident I've already described, where the guy from People magazine gets terminated because Time has merged with Warner, and the guy who runs Time Warner, the CEO chair, Steve Ross, makes $78 million, thanks largely to the merger. And then they lay off 600 magazine employees. To me, even back then, that's 1991. It was 35 years ago. It was really dire. The journalists were getting killed and the people owning the media were getting rich. It's more dire today, but we have an internet now and we didn't have that then. And the growth of independent nonprofit media and independent media, it's been because of the internet. And that's what I studied. I was at Ithaca from 2008 to 2018. And the independent nonprofit sector and the independent sector, they were growing because of the internet. And that's why I always said protecting the net neutrality is crucial. And that's in danger now because of Trump.
Well, on that note, unfortunately, Jeff, we're gonna have to let you go, but Professor Cohen, Jeff Cohen, founder of FAIR, journalism professor, you were just dropping gem after gem after gem after gem. So Dom and I are trying to figure out, that's a quote card. That's a quote card. So really great stuff. Thank you so much.
If people want my columns, both the ones about media and the ones about politics, are at jeffcohen.org.
We'll make sure to include that in our link too.
Absolutely.
In our description.
Nice meeting you too.
You too.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate this.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jeff.
Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia.
Music provided by Jake Howitt. Research by Laura Rothenbucker.
You can watch and follow us on YouTube.
Or you can listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you have any questions or suggestions, we want to hear from you. So leave a comment.
We do check them.
Or reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com.
New episodes every Friday.